A reading from Exodus. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction." So Moses set out with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. To the elders he said, "Wait here for us until we come to you again, for Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute may go to them." Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the 7th day he called to Moses out of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain. Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights.
If you are able, please stand for the gospel reading. "6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, 'Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from a cloud a voice said, 'This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him.' When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, 'Get up and do not be afraid.' And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, 'Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead.' This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. The Christian life is lived in the tension between contemplation and action, meditation and mission, being and doing. And so far in this season of Epiphany, we've focused most of our attention on the action, mission, doing part. We've highlighted our mission partners who help us do what we've been calling our light work in the world. That is, Jesus is the light of the world, and he calls us to let his light shine through us to others. And so, Sunday by Sunday, we've been featuring different partners, like the Gaston Christian Center you heard so beautifully about today, who help us do that. And we'll get to more of that in just a moment. But right now, in this transitional Sunday between Epiphany and Lent, we need another moment, a moment with God, a moment to absorb the radiant energy of the Christ who is among us. It can't all be about work. It has to be about worship too, else we'll burn out in exhaustion. We breathe in to breathe out. Worship resupplies our spiritual oxygen. It recharges us. Now, this may be part of what is the meaning of Moses up on the mountain, or what the disciples, Peter, James, and John, experienced, maybe even Jesus himself. They all had a transforming encounter with the light of God in their mountaintop experience. And mountains have always been thought of as holy places. Have you thought of that? Probably because of our penchant for thinking about transcendence in prepositions that are upward. That is, up, over, above, that sort of thing. We feel closer to God the higher we get. And I mean that topographically, not pharmacologically, choir. So just to clarify, the choir, yeah. But if you've ever climbed a mountain or ridden a ski lift to the top of one, you know the overwhelming feeling of looking around the world and sensing the sacredness of it all, don't you? The air is cleaner up there, even if thinner. You put yourself in position to think differently and see differently, and if you pay attention in those moments, it's not the lack of oxygen or only the view that takes your breath away. We don't have to climb mountains, though, to experience God. Mountains are movable as spiritual experience goes. Mountaintop experiences are portable. God is not spatially limited to high places. God is. Period. So God can be experienced everywhere, wherever we go, wherever we are. We do, however, have to stop and become mindful of God wherever we are, especially given the busyness and noisiness of our lives, right? We need to get centered and settled. We need to get in touch with the source of our lives and grounded again in the deepest truths our hearts can grasp. Most notably, that we are divinely and unconditionally and eternally loved. We're loved for who we are because of whose we are. This inner experience of being with God then leads us to a kind of surrender to God, a trust in God, a belief that God is with us and for us, and there is nothing in heaven and earth that is more important than that. That's also part of what happened, I think, to Moses on the mountain. He's gone up into the cloud of unknowing. He's entered into the mystery on the mountain. God told him to go up on the mountain and notice what to do there? Wait. Just wait on the Lord. And 6 days he is there. What is he doing? Probably the work that each of us would probably be doing ourselves if we were in his place. That is, somehow letting go of the fear and uncertainty, the worry and concern that is always with us until he's ready to hear. And on the seventh day, think Sabbath, God speaks to him. This is the way it often works with us. We have to be still and let all of our feelings of guilt and fear run themselves ragged in our soul until exhausted, we are ready to hear. Nanette Sawyer tells about such an experience. Here's how she described it. I was on a silent retreat, she says, a 3-day retreat. I was doing the kind of begging prayer that we humans can fall into sometimes, a please, please, please prayer. You know that one? Right? I prayed for relief from emotional pain. Honestly, I cannot even remember what was so bad at the time, but I was definitely crying while I prayed, please, please take away this pain. That was the refrain of my prayer, and it went on for a long time with a vigorous intensity. And suddenly, different words popped into my head. It felt like a sudden, piercing stream of light shone into the darkness. But it wasn't light, it was words spoken in my head in an exasperated tone. Let go. It didn't feel like a thought that emerged from my own mind. Rather, I heard these words in my mind like they had been inserted there, like someone had spoken directly into my mind. When those words, let go, shone into my mind and shocked me, not just the words themselves, but their exasperated tone, I dropped my experience of pain and had an entirely new experience, one of astonishment. I realized in that moment that I could choose how much attention to give my sorrow. I had the capacity to drop it, to let it go. When those words shone. What a phrase. Words, light, yes, words that enlighten, that shine. Words from God do that. We feel the warmth and light of God's love that touches us and heals us and renews us. When Peter, James, and John went up with Jesus to the mountain, Jesus had just rebuked Peter, remember, just verses earlier, for his wanting Jesus to organize a rebellion against Rome. Jesus told them that they must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. Think they might have been a bit anxious about what might happen next? So what happens next is they go up the mountain with Jesus, and Jesus was transfigured and shone like the sun. They saw him with Moses and Elijah, and Peter's reaction was typical for Peter. He starts talking. He wants to do something for these spiritual heroes. 3 shelters, 1 for each of you. He still can't sit still in it all and let go. Then the words from heaven, this is my son whom I love. Listen to him. Listen to him. The disciples fall to the ground in fear. And what happens next? The shining Jesus comes to them and touches them. A light touch, I imagine. He doesn't come and shake them and say, why can't you get it? He just comes and touches them and calms them down, driving away their fear. When Mike Maddox was the pitching coach for the Texas Rangers, he had a little ritual when he would go to the mound. So almost every time, a pitcher would get in trouble somehow, he'd be in a jam, and he'd start to, you could tell, get anxious and tense, and we didn't know what was going to happen next. Maddox would go to the mound, and he would bring some calming words, but as he did, he would come and he would put his hand on the pitcher's shoulder and leave it there while he talked to him the whole time. A light touch, I think. We need that, to calm us with the words, the touch. These experiences can happen to us, I tell you, whether you're on a mound or a mountain. at a retreat or just sitting in contemplative prayer in the comfiest chair in your own home, they can also happen in corporate worship, like right here. Worship invites us into a cloud of unknowing and into a mystery of God's presence. We come into this room bringing all the confusing, paradoxical feelings of our busyness and loneliness, our feelings of self-importance and inadequacy. It's hard to sit still, isn't it? To settle down, to just be. But when we do, before long, we hear a voice that says to us, let go. And then we feel a light touch that allows us not to be afraid. It heals and restores our soul. Our children's minister, Julie Gerards, posted a piece this week on Facebook about children and worship. It decries the trend among so many churches to produce and worship a flashy sound and light show to get everyone's attention. Somehow every church has to draw young adults, and to draw young adults you got to draw their kids, or else your church is going to die. You know how that whole thing goes. And so some churches are doing whatever they can, but in trying to do so in order to get the kids' attention, notice what happens. The attention shifts from God to us. Children need to be in worship, even if they don't yet understand it. Do we? They need to sit with the rest of us, learning to listen to old words from the Bible, to sing old songs to unfamiliar tunes, to feel the difference between the usual rhythms of their life and the pulse of the Spirit. True worship is communing with God, letting go of our focus on ourselves. We wait for the light touch of Jesus that comes when at last we surrender ourselves completely and listen for that word that shines. The other thing that happens in our churches, and happens here, is that parents make the choice just to bring their kids to Sunday school, and then they all go home. Sunday school is a great tool for Christian education. It isn't worship. It has a good but different aim. And if you want your kids to get caught up in wonder, love, and praise for God, they need to be with us here in all their wiggliness and cluelessness until at last the cloud dissipates and they see Jesus in all his glory. All right, so now part 2 of the sermon, and don't worry, it's not as long as part 1, don't you know? Having had an experience then with the transfigured Jesus in worship that transforms us, that's only half the story. We are also called to go from these experiences and to bring Christ's light touch to an anxious and hurting world. A woman was visiting a Quaker service one Sunday when she became impatient as they sat there, as Quakers do, just listening quietly. Nothing seeming to happen. She turned to a man who was sitting near her in the pew, and she said, "Excuse me, but when does the service begin?" And the man looked at her and said, "When the meeting is over." Enter to worship depart to serve, the old adage goes. Contemplation leads to action, and action back to contemplation. Worship leads to service, and service back to worship. We love God with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind, and we love our neighbor as ourselves. These are not two things, they are two parts of one thing. It's a never-ending circle of being and doing. We've been touched by Christ, and we go and touch the world in the name of Christ. Now, you might object that Jesus told his disciples on their way down the mountain not to tell anyone what they had experienced until he was raised from the dead. Now, we can go into the reasons for that another time, but here's the thing, people. Now is not the same time as then. He has now been raised from the dead. No need to hold back. Time to get involved in the world. Former Dallas Morning News journalist Rob Dreher has written a new book called The Benedict Option, a strategy for Christians in a post-Christian nation. Dreher is pessimistic about this time. He believes that the light of the Christian faith is flickering out all over the West, and only the willfully blind refuse to see it. He worries that civilization is becoming less Christian and thus falling apart. Attempts to rebuild it now are doomed to fail. Now is the time, he thinks, to deploy the strategy of the 6th century monk St. Benedict of Nursia. Nursia is in central Italy in the Umbria province near Perugia. Benedict preserved the light of the gospel, he thinks, through his monastic movement during the Dark Ages, until at last, 5 centuries later, there could be a rebirth of civilization. Dreher thinks it's time for Christians to become deeply committed to their faith in small communities, separated from and withdrawn from the world, so that we won't be contaminated by it. I'm sympathetic to his call, but isn't that what we do every week when we gather here to worship? I mean, we don't need to take our kids out of public schools and put them in Christian schools just to protect them from the corrupting influences around them. We need to form them in the faith well enough so that they can touch the world with God's love, even as children. We don't need to throw up our hands in despair over the state of the world, its politics, the sin around us everywhere. We need to reach out our hands to the world and touch it, a light touch, with grace. A modern monk named Geoffrey Tristram gets the last word. Each of us has been entrusted with the light of the gospel. It's a light which was handed on to us by others. What do you need to do in your own life of discipleship to ensure that that precious candle burns brightly and that you will be able to pass it on to the next generation? They're depending on you. Amen.